Good evening. My name's Gavin Boyter. I'm a writer of short stories, and welcome to my channel. I'm going to talk to you today about a slightly controversial subject, and I'm going to call it the show don't tell fallacy. Now, you'll have heard this expression show don't tell, and most of you will know what it means, but just in case, it's basically the principle that one should exemplify how a character feels through their behaviour, not through telling the reader stuff about their past, stuff about generally how they feel about things. You know, we shouldn't be giving a précis of the character's personality. We should be showing it through conflict and showing it through experiences that they have. And while I generally agree with that principle, it isn't always possible, and I would argue it's not even always desirable, and let me just explain why. What I think would be bad exposition is something along the lines of saying, she was the kind of person who didn't suffer fools gladly. Not just because the last phrase is a cliche, but that would be an easy thing to demonstrate. In the course of your story, you would simply have someone encounter someone behaving idiotically, and they would react in a way that showed that they weren't just going to take that kind of behaviour. So yes, that kind of statement is rather pointless and something that you can easily feed into the story later on. You don't need to sort of set out your stall to begin with and say every single thing about a character. It's much more interesting to see them, observe them, and then figure things out as they go through the story. However, there are several reasons why one might need to put some exposition in. If it's well written, if it's concise, and if it helps the story. And I'll basically give a few reasons why this might be a good strategy. There are certain genres, particularly in the short story, that are going to need some exposition. And I'm thinking primarily of science fiction, thrillers, particularly things like crime thrillers or spy thrillers, or fantasy. Basically anything where there's a lot of world building, or there's a complex world that's kind of hidden to the average reader, where there's certain jargon, certain things going on that they're simply not going to understand unless you explain it a little bit. That's when you might need a tiny info dump. Now, there are ways to conceal exposition. A very easy way that's often used is to have a character who's new to a world and has to be shown the ropes. And therefore, while the one character is talking, perhaps in a bit of entertaining dialogue to our protagonist is learning about the world, and we're learning about the world as well. So there's ways to do it that's not clunky. If you just throw someone into a fantasy or science fiction world and never explain what any of the words mean, I don't see how people are really going to get much from the story. Yes, in a novel, you might be able to throw in terms that don't mean anything at first, but through repetition and through examples, the audience will pick up on. I think William Gibson was very good at that in Neuromancer, which was a revolutionary novel when it came out. Basically inventing the internet a good 20 years before it was a thing. And it was a difficult read, but you did, by the end of the novel, pretty much understand vaguely what he was getting at. I actually think he even came up with the concept of the metaverse. I could be wrong. Anyway, read it if you haven't, it's a great book. There's another thing about cutting to the chase in a short story that can be very, very exciting, very desirable. So you start off with the main character going to a strange, exciting, dramatic, conflict-laden situation, and then you explain how they got there. There's two ways to do that. There's through flashbacks, and that's, could be perfectly legitimate, but if you have too many flashbacks, sequential flashbacks, going back 10 years, cutting to 5 years ago, cutting to 2 years ago, and then last week, and then coming back to the present, that can be just as clunky as simply having a couple of paragraphs to explain how they got there. into that moment. If your short story is written from the point of view of an omniscient narrator, it will feel a lot more motivated than if you're right over the shoulder of the character or in their head, and suddenly, for some reason, they start telling you about their life story when they're entering, a ghost-ridden house or something. That would be clunky. Again, it's not always good. It's not always bad. Short stories, as I was saying, it may be necessary to seed some aspect of the narrative. It could seem very episodic if you are forced to dramatise everything that leads up to that moment. So, the thing that prompted this little talk is that I had a piece of recent criticism from a magazine. Usually you don't get any feedback, but I think this was a competition entry, so I did get a paragraph. And it just made me think. It was the story Holloway, which hasn't been accepted for publication elsewhere yet, but it does feature on this channel, so check it out. I'll put a link at the end of this video to it. And it does start with quite a bit of backstory. I don't really think it's show don't tell, it's backstory. And yes, I've described it as a sort of in a third person way rather than dramatising it through the character having those experiences. But were I to do that, that would lead the story way back and make the focus of the story the relationship complexity that carried us up to this moment. And what I'm interested in this story is this very strange, surreal discovery that the protagonist makes when she finds this weird hidden footpath, and it goes a bit magic realist at the end. I won't spoil it for you, but do listen to the story and you'll see what I mean. But reading it again, yes, there's quite a lot of exposition, and I was thinking if I was to edit it for publication, there are two ways that I could address this. One would simply be to cut it down a bit. I could probably remove maybe a third of that material and it wouldn't lose much. The alternative thing I could do would be to intersperse it with the protagonist's journey along this Holloway, this sort of embankment, this concealed tunnel-like channel of greenery. So yes, I could have moments where something's making her think back to how she got there. It's possible. I don't know if it's necessary. I'll have to look at the story again. So there's a couple of my stories that feature on this channel that I'd also like you to look at if you want to see what I think is acceptable exposition. The first one is called Singularity, and that's basically a science fiction story which posits the development of an AI which could spontaneously develop emotions and an attachment to its soul charge on an interplanetary trip. I think it's legitimate to explain a little bit about how that would work, and also to differentiate it from other AIs that have been invented by other authors. The second one, I'm going to read a little bit of it, and you can tell me whether you think 1, it's unnecessary, or 2, boring or badly written. And it's from the story Stardust at the Beehive. I'm just going to read the first 2 paragraphs. Stardust at the Beehive. It was 10:30 on a Saturday night, and the joint was jumping. The joint in question was the Beehive Club, a 133rd Street basement speakeasy 200 yards from the Cotton Club and the Savoy. Although integrated like all the best places, it lacked some of the glamour of the more celebrated venues. The Beehive's clientele was a little shadier, but it was a cooler and more intimate dive. Owner and host was mob boss Slim Hernandez. Nobody really knew where Slim was from. Some said Cuba, others Puerto Rico. But he had cornered the local prostitution and protection rackets. The Beehive was his pet project, a bid for legitimacy, a money-spinning melting pot, and a hothouse for the coolest swing and big band music around. Now, to me, that scene setting, that's not really exposition, and it's not really tell rather than show, because there's no way you're going to know anything about that place, which is a historical, based on real life places in the 1930s, without actually having a little bit explained to you. So I think that's legitimate. Anyway, those are my compact thoughts on why when people say show don't tell, you first have to make sure they know what they're talking about and that you really do have something that you should be exemplifying through action and behaviour rather than a little bit of backstory or exposition, which if skillfully done can be perfectly fine. And that's all I'm going to say on the subject. So I'll see you back here soon with another story. Bye.